It began with blackmail, a request for money in exchange for silence. The caller believed that Ruth Finley would be embarrassed if her current friends and coworkers learned about an awful assault that she had endured as a teenager. And he was right. It began with blackmail, but it turned into years of harassment, cruel pranks, hang-up calls, hundreds of letters. Rambling and rhyming, threatening and menacing letters. Some sent to police, some to local newspapers, but mostly sent directly to Ruth. She was a middle-aged mother who worked here in the Southwestern Bell Building in Wichita, Kansas. It was here in the lobby that a 12-inch butcher's knife was discovered after a threatening call was reported from inside the building. They named him the Poet for the bizarre way the letters were written. One letter Ruth received read, "Thoughts like snakes twine in your brain. No, I won't stop till you're dead or insane." And it seemed like the poet would make good on that threat. There were phone lines cut, jars of human waste left on Ruth's front porch. Even her Christmas wreath was set aflame. It was along these streets that Ruth was followed and assaulted. As the attacks escalated, police ramped up their investigation, but were unable to identify Ruth's harasser. Could she be the next victim of Wichita's own serial killer, BTK, they wondered? Or was the poet some other monster completely? Ruth's stalker eluded detection for years, fooling even seasoned senior detectives. When the poet's identity was finally revealed, it surprised the entire community. Welcome to downtown Wichita and the haunting of Ruth Finley. The blackmail began with a phone call. It came in late one night the summer of 1977. It was rare for Ruth to be home alone, especially at night, but on this day, Ruth's husband Ed had collapsed while working in the backyard and was in the hospital while medical professionals attended to what they believed was a heart attack. When the phone rang at 10:30 that evening, Ruth expected it to be a nurse calling from the hospital with a status update. "Hello," she answered. "Is this Ruth Smock from Fort Scott, Kansas?" asked the man on the other line. "Yes, it is," she replied, assuming that the caller must be a relative or an old acquaintance from her past. It had been several decades since Ruth had lived in Fort Scott. The man, who did not identify himself, began to ask Ruth a series of intrusive questions about the apartment she had lived in. Confused, but trying not to be rude, Ruth answered his questions truthfully, though vaguely. "Look," he said, "I know all about that night." "You do?" Ruth asked, shocked. "I do," he responded, before launching into the reading of an article about Ruth from 1946. The local newspaper called it one of the worst instances of sadism to occur here in years. 16-year-old Ruth Smock had been living in the downstairs apartment of a rooming house in Fort Scott, where she attended school and worked as a telephone operator. Her parents had lived just 15 miles away in Richards, Missouri. The apartment was owned by an elderly couple who were out of town that evening. Ruth was alone in the apartment, reading in the parlor. A man entered, potentially through an unlocked side door. He turned out the lights and said, "Hi, sis." He asked her why she had all the lights on. Confused, Ruth barely had a chance to react before the stranger pushed a bottle of chloroform under her nose. She lost consciousness and only vaguely recalled the man's leather gloves and seeing a figure in the room heating flat irons on the stove. When Ruth woke, she was on the kitchen floor, with blood oozing from her badly burned legs. Ruth had been branded on both thighs and had been repeatedly scratched or cut all over her face, neck, and legs. The cuts were mostly superficial, and authorities seemed conflicted about what caused them, with ideas ranging from a knife to a sharp bobby pin. A journalist with the Associated Press sold the story of Ruth's assault, and it appeared in dozens of newspapers all across the nation. Some of them printed her photo. Her assailant had never been caught. But the event had occurred more than 30 years before this late night phone call. The burns had healed, and her scars had long faded. Ruth was bewildered. Why would someone care now? The man on the phone admitted that while working for a construction company, he had discovered a trove of old papers during a building demolition. Within the pages of those papers, he had uncovered what he believed to be embarrassing stories about 3 individuals. He planned to call each one and demand money for his silence. "I know where you work," the stranger said. "If you don't do what I want, I might just leave that article where everyone can see it." Exasperated and upset, Ruth hung up the phone and went to bed. Several weeks later, the article about her assault appeared on her desk in an envelope addressed to her at work. She ripped it up and tried to ignore it, but the reminder stung and nagged at the back of her mind. 3 decades later, Ruth still works for Southwestern Bell Telephone Company, just like she did when she was 16. Though now she is the secretary for the district marketing manager. Ruth is a self-described dull woman. She prizes order above chaos, manners over informality, and likes for things to remain clean and predictable. Her husband, Ed Finley, is an accountant at a small construction firm. They were both modest, unassuming, and liked to keep to themselves. Ruth was described by her friends and coworkers as quiet, shy, and respectable. With their 2 sons grown and gone, the Finleys had taken up artistic hobbies to pass the time. In the evenings, Ed liked to paint, landscapes mostly, Midwestern fields and farms, while Ruth preferred to create ceramics. She spent her spare time making vases, jars, and small animal sculptures. Over the next few months, the blackmailer called the Finley home frequently, but before he could get much more than a word in, Ruth would hang up. Several times, Ed picked up the phone, but the stranger would not speak with him, and Ed assumed that the silence was just some kid playing pranks. Ruth and Ed lived in a modest 1-story home on the east side of Wichita, but they both worked downtown and would ride together in the mornings. Because Ruth got off work before Ed did, she would often window shop in the afternoons while waiting for him to wrap up his duties as an accountant. That same summer, Ruth encountered a strange man while window shopping downtown on Douglas Avenue. He spoke nonsense, telling her first that she did a good job at work this week and should take the weekend off. He told her that he knows she works at the phone company before launching into a story about gambling. "Would you like to go to Las Vegas sometime?" he asks her. The man is in his late 40s, approximately 5'9" tall, and thin. He has black hair, graying at his temples. When Ruth tries to walk away, he begins to follow her around, declaring that some people's fantasies are other people's nightmares. He promises that he'll see her again, a promise that he does keep, though it will be nearly a year later. In August of 1978, Ruth saw that same man again, and this time he recognizes her instantly. He grabs her wrist when she passes him in an alley. Ruth breaks free of his grasp and runs across the street into the downtown Macy's store. This time, she reports the incident to the police station, but the local authorities take no follow-up action. Police in Wichita had their hands full with BTK, a serial killer who had been menacing and murdering the city's residents for 4 years, taking the lives of 7 people so far. BTK had sent letters to police and media, taunting authorities with details of his crimes. However, he had only attacked victims inside their own homes and was not known or suspected of stalking women through alleyways downtown. Any similarities between the 2 cases were ignored, at least for the time being. In October of 1978, The first letter arrived in Ruth's home mailbox. Inside of a plain and unexceptional envelope addressed to Ruth was a single sheet of paper. "Fuck you. Fuck the police. Fuck the telephone company," was scribbled at the top. The writer demanded money and threatened injury to Ruth if she did not comply. Frightened, Ruth brought this letter to her husband, Ed, who insisted that they make another visit to the police, who were still pretty underwhelmed by the case, though they took the letters from the Finleys and sent them over to their forensics department where they were checked for fingerprints. Over the next several weeks, more letters arrived. The author wrote frequently of Ruth's brands and continued to demand money, though they would also sometimes launch into indecipherable tirades full of complex and intentionally misspelled words like consentaneous, rhodomontade, and made-up words like sanchused. The phone calls continued as well, though when Ed answered, he was usually greeted only by a dial tone, or sometimes a male voice that asked for Ruth, and then hung up. Then, just 2 days before Thanksgiving, on November 21st, 1978, Ruth was discovered missing after she did not return from her lunch break at work. Ruth's boss called her sister Jean, who also worked at the phone company, and sometimes had lunch with Ruth. When Jean hadn't heard from Ruth or seen her sister, she called Ed. But Ed didn't know where his wife was. No one knew where Ruth had gone. Ed alerted the police, who began their search, starting with the Southwestern Bell building downtown. Hours passed before a phone call came into the station. Ruth had been found at a liquor store near a park 30 miles from her office. A car was sent to pick her up, and finally Ruth was reunited with her husband and family back at the Wichita police station, where she described in detail her harrowing tale. After doing some shopping at a greeting card store on Market Street, Ruth's path had been suddenly blocked by a blue-green 1964 Chevrolet Bel Air that had pulled up to the curb. A stranger jumped out, kicked her in the shin, and shoved her into the back seat. She told police that there were 2 men, one of which had previously accosted her downtown. For 4 hours, Ruth endured their erratic driving and disturbing conversations. Finally, she begged for a bathroom, and though suspicious, one of them agreed to stop. As she exited the car, Ruth seized the opportunity to use a hidden can of mace that she had begun carrying. She incapacitated her abductor and made a desperate escape, running erratically into the woods and hiding in some bushes until after sunset, when she finally felt safe to leave. Dashing across the street into a liquor store, Ruth breathlessly announced to staff, "Someone's after me." The store owner called police, and at Ruth's request, her husband Ed, too. At the station, Wichita Police Lieutenant Bernard Drawatsky told Ed that Ruth's kidnappers had stolen her $315 paycheck and a $100 savings bond. He did not tell Ed that Ruth's tormentor might be the BTK strangler. Overlapping of key words between BTK's letters and the letters that Ruth had received had some detectives believing that Ruth might be the killer's next victim. Lieutenant Drawatsky had spent a lot of time on the BTK case and had even been the detective that recovered the killer's first letter, the one in which he gave himself the infamous code name BTK, standing for bind them, torture them, kill them. The next day, the lieutenant sent a detective to search for clues in the park where Ruth had escaped. He found Ruth's shoes and sweater, but no additional clues to her abductors' identities could be uncovered. Following the best lead they had, police ran a check of every 1964 Chevy Bel Air in the city, diligently locating the owners of each vehicle. But unfortunately, no plausible suspects emerged from this list. Authorities ramped up their investigation, setting up intermittent surveillance of Ruth during her lunch breaks and shopping trips. Together with Ed and a detective, Ruth traveled back to Fort Scott to look for possible suspects. She went through every mugshot on file at the Fort Scott Police Department, but saw no one that looked like either of her kidnappers. Frustrated but determined, Lieutenant Drowatsky made Ruth's plight public, telling her story on a local radio talk show. Ruth and a team of detectives listened to the voices of all the people that called into the radio station, but none of the voices were recognizable and none belonged to their suspect. Ruth wanted answers, but the publicity of it all bothered her. She hated to be the subject of gossip and talk. Additionally, her mother had always taught her that asking for help was a sign of weakness, and here she was, calling attention to herself, asking for help, and all of it was broadcast for the world to hear. Privately, Ed notices that the stress has caused Ruth increasing headaches. She doesn't sleep well, and also sometimes suffers from severe stomach cramps. As 1978 became 1979, more and more letters arrived at Ruth's home and her office. The local Wichita newspaper, the Eagle Beacon, receives a letter, as did Lieutenant Drowatsky. But as summer hit its stride in July of 1979, the letters slowed and then stopped. Hopeful that things were going to return to normal, Ruth and Ed consider taking their annual August trip to Colorado. Ruth even decides to pick up a new pair of jeans for the vacation and chooses to go to the Town East Square shopping center, all by herself. It has been weeks since she received a letter and nearly 10 months since her kidnapping and narrow escape. But while Ruth may feel a false sense of security, things are about to get a whole lot worse. While returning to her car from the Dillard's department store, Ruth was stabbed repeatedly. She was stabbed in the back twice and again in her side. With an 8-inch boning knife still protruding from her body, Ruth somehow manages to maneuver herself safely into her car, and with blood pooling in her seat, she drives quickly out of the mall parking lot. Though her vision is hazy, in the rearview mirror, she can barely make out the man standing in the parking lot, the same one who had kidnapped her before. She drove out of sight to a nearby gas station where, still bleeding heavily, she phoned the police. Given that she was just a few minutes from home, Ruth drives there next, where Ed takes over the wheel and drives Ruth to the nearest hospital. Doctors sewed up Ruth's wounds, commenting that one was near fatal, and had the knife plunged any deeper, she would have likely been killed. Ruth's stabbing makes the papers, and a suspect sketch is printed with a warning that the man is considered extremely dangerous. A guard is posted outside of her room for protection. After 9 long days of recovery, Ruth was released from the hospital, and the following day, a nurse tells police that a man fitting the suspect's description had stopped by the nurse's station to ask about Ruth. Alarmed, Lieutenant Drowatsky assigns Ruth 24-hour protection. But while this may have made the Finleys feel a little safer at home, it does little to actually uncover Ruth's stalker's identity. Frustrated by their lack of progress, Ed attempts to draw the kidnapper out himself. He takes out an ad in the newspaper. It reads, "Poet, tell me what I owe you. RSF." With this ad, Ed gives the poet his name and the case a title. That fall and into winter, more and more letters arrived from the poet. 2 days before Christmas, one is found stuffed into the slats of the Finleys' back porch. It is the first incident to occur at their home. The very next day, their phone lines are cut while the family is celebrating Christmas Eve. Southwestern Bell buries their replacement cable. And the police install a second dummy phone line above ground, as well as an electronic alarm system. A month later, Ruth reported receiving a call at work from the poet. "I have a surprise for you in the lobby," he said. Immediately, Ruth calls the police, who in turn called in the lab, just in case that surprise turned out to be a bomb. But when detectives arrived, they found a 12-inch butcher's knife. It had been wrapped in a red bandana and left in the phone booth in the lobby. A note for Ruth read, "Shut your eyes and think of the 12-inch blade. Will you remember the hole it made? Dream of me and obey my commands. Think of me with a knife in my hands." Police interviewed other Southwestern Bell employees and found 2 witnesses that reported seeing a man in the phone booth who resembled the suspect sketch of the poet. They sent the knife to forensics for analysis. When Lieutenant Drowatsky is promoted, Ruth's case is passed on to Captain Mike Hill. In addition to reviewing all of the department's files on the poet, the captain calls a press conference to draw attention to their suspect. Police Captain Hill, who has himself received a letter, calls the poet a virtual psychopath and adds that some of his letters include complicated psychological terms. He says, quote, "We think he's locked into playing this game of harassment of the victim." Hill won't comment publicly on how they are protecting Mrs. Finley, but calls her case his top priority. Privately, police are escorting Ruth to work and conducting surveillance on her house, some even volunteering to do so on their own time. Ruth, who often felt bad for the officers assigned to her home, bakes them desserts to show her gratitude. Police tell the press that they believe that the poet's threats can be traced to Fort Scott, Kansas, where Ruth had been assaulted and branded on both thighs as a teenager. But they don't believe that the man that assaulted her in 1946 is the same person involved in the recent attacks, because that person would be much older by now. Authorities believe that the poet is a man in his 40s. He is described as 5'8" to 5'10" tall, with graying hair and gold wire-rimmed glasses. Frightened, Ruth doesn't talk much about the poet with her friends or family, but she does bravely assist in attempts to lure the poet into the open. She wears a bulletproof vest and is shadowed by plainclothes police officers while walking downtown. But while this orchestrated trick is attempted several times, it is ineffective, and her attacker remains elusive. That February, Ruth received a valentine that was printed in the local paper. "Here's to you a tender valentine, red with blood and tied with twine. Nothing too much for a valentine, gone from here by a whim of mine." It had arrived in the mail with a swatch of red bandana wrapped in twine. After that, someone called the post office and stopped mail service to the Finley home. Captain Hill called it another of his harassing, cowardly ways of making her life miserable. Open to trying new tactics to uncover the identity of the poet, law enforcement brought in Dr. Donald Schrag, a local psychologist, to hypnotize Ruth. They hoped that under hypnosis, Ruth will be able to recall more details about the crimes and her attacker. In general, Ruth found that being hypnotized was a calming experience, though she notably grew agitated when recalling her kidnapping, yelling, "I want out of the car!" A new suspect sketch was released. This time, the drawing was created while Ruth was interviewed under hypnosis. Dr. Schrag thought that this sketch would better represent the actual assailant, saying a person who is a victim of potentially very frightening crime possibly will repress their recall. There is a difference between remembering or imagining what happened and reliving it. End quote. The psychologist told reporters that Ruth focused on facial features during the hypnosis. When asked about what he thinks about the poet, Dr. Schrag said that he thought that the poet was intelligent, but has, quote, serious emotional and mental problems. It is revealed that the poet had been writing to police since the previous April and had written to KAKE, a local Wichita television station. The poet had also ordered black flowers delivered to the Finleys' home, requested that a construction company tear up the Finleys' driveway, and lied to the health department about Ruth spreading venereal diseases. Ed's company, Halsey Tevis, offered a $3,000 reward for information about the case, and police were hopeful that the accomplice, the man who drove the car on the day that Ruth was abducted, would come forward. But they waited while tips came in, and no one claimed to be the driver for Ruth's kidnapping that day. Then, one of the poet's letters arrived in an envelope postmarked from Oklahoma City. When police in Oklahoma received a tip about a man who resembled the poet sketch and had been previously fired from a job in Wichita, Captain Hill was hopeful that they'd found their man. The suspect was flown into Wichita for a lineup. He is the first suspect held in the case, but Ruth does not pick him out of the lineup and states that he is not the man responsible. The rest of 1980 was a whirlwind of publicity and harassment. Captain Hill gave an interview to the National Enquirer, who published a story on Ruth titled, "She's Living a Nightmare, the Victim of a Crazed Tormentor." The poet wrote to many additional local businesses, asking that the bank transfer out all of her money and requesting that the DMV revoke her license due to Ruth's supposed dangerous driving. Police built a camera into a birdhouse placed in the Finleys' backyard, but when Ruth and Ed are at the symphony that November, 2 Molotov cocktails are found on the Finleys' front porch. A month later, the Christmas wreath on the Finleys' door is set on fire, while the family had been home, and they hadn't heard anything until a window broke from the heat of the flames. Spring and summer of 1981 were equally full of harassing poetry and destruction to the Finleys' property. On the morning of April Fool's Day, Ed and Ruth woke up to find pieces of concrete had been hurled at the front of their home. In July, it was firecrackers in the mailbox, and in August, a jar of feces thrown at the front porch. Despite the police surveillance and heightened awareness of the Finleys and all of their neighbors, no one had seen anything. No one had witnessed anyone lurking nearby or behaving suspiciously in the neighborhood. Over the course of their investigation, 156 police officers had pursued countless leads and looked into more than 500 suspects. It would be the chief of police, Richard Lemunyon, who finally solved the case. On September 4th, 1981, authorities received a letter from the poet naming the chief's wife, Sharon, as his next victim. "That was it for me," the chief said. "I decided it was time for me to take over the case. I wanted it over." Chief Lemunyon spent that weekend going over all of the case files that the department had on the poet. 14 large notebooks full of reports and files. Taking detailed notes, he prepared a list of reasons for why he believed that the poet was someone on the inside. 1. The Finleys' home was situated on a dead-end street, yet none of the neighbors or police surveillance had ever spotted the poet. 2. As soon as the birdhouse camera had been placed, the poet's visits to the Finley backyard had stopped. 3. Captain Hill had received a letter from the poet as soon as he took over the case, but before his position in the investigation had been made public. Furthermore, Chief LeMunyon decided that the poet was likely Ruth herself. His reasons for believing this were: 1. Despite occurring in public, no one had ever witnessed Ruth's interactions with the poet. 2. The search of the park, where Ruth had maced and escaped her captors, had turned up no evidence of anyone other than Ruth. Only her clothes and her shoes had been found there. And 3. Messages from the poet were never sent or posted to the classified ads while the Finleys were on their annual vacation. It was as if the poet took a vacation as well. Chief LeMunyon reached out to Dr. Schrag to see if he thought that Ruth could be the poet, but the doctor was certain that it was not possible. He had hypnotized Ruth. He was convinced that she had been kidnapped. However, LeMunyon was growing more and more certain that Ruth and the poet were one and the same. The following Friday, on September 11, 1981, LeMunyon called a meeting with 16 investigators that had worked on the case. They discussed the chief's notes, the case files, and his list of reasons. Before the stabbing, it had occurred to some investigators that Ruth might have been writing the letters. But after the stabbing, the doctors had said it would have been impossible for her to stab herself that way. The investigators reviewed the medical reports again. Could the doctors have been wrong? It was that day that the Wichita police decided to follow the two suspects closest to the case that they had not yet investigated: Ruth and Ed Finley. Not everyone was pleased about this move to investigate the Finleys. Many of the detectives and officers had gotten close to Ruth and Ed. The couple both seemed so kind and gentle, too calm and too normal to be suspected of something so bizarre and crazy as harassing oneself. But LeMunyon instructed his officers to spend the next 2 weeks on round-the-clock surveillance of the Finleys. They were assigned 12-hour shifts and were warned that secrecy was a top priority. If any media learned of their task, every single one of them would be fired. 3 days after beginning their surveillance, 8:30 Wednesday morning on September 17th, a police helicopter pilot watched Ed and Ruth drive up to a mailbox and drop a bundle of letters into the slot. Inside the mailbox, they recovered 2 poet letters sandwiched between bill payments paid by the Finleys. However, because the mail had not been retrieved until 1:30 that afternoon, police could not be certain that the letters had been deposited by Ruth and Ed. So, when the Finleys returned to the Eastgate mailbox 9 days later, an undercover police car pulls up as soon as they drive away. This time, the mail can be retrieved immediately. And on top are 4 letters left by the Finleys: 2 bills, 1 personal letter, and a letter from the poet addressed to Ruth. "No dumb will get the f***ing law to get me," the letter read, ironically. A search warrant turns up a roll of stamps from Ruth's desk at work that matches perforations on the stamps from poet letters, as well as 1 red bandana. On October 1st, 1981, Lieutenant Drowatsky picked up Ruth at the Southwestern Bell building after work. He brought her to the station where, initially, she denied writing the poet letters. But confronted with surveillance photos of herself making the mail drop, Ruth began to question her own memories. Had it happened? Flashbulb recollections of herself seated at a desk and writing appeared in her mind. Seated in front of Captain Hill, after an hour and a half of questioning, Ruth began to cry. "Why did you do it?" he asked her softly. "I don't know why," she replied. Why did you stab yourself? I don't know, Ruth replied again, and sobbing. She maintained that the branding in Fort Scott had truly happened, but finally admitted that she had set fire to the Christmas wreath. And everything else? Hill asked. Ruth nodded. I must be crazy, she said. You are just ill, was the captain's response. Certain now that Ruth needed help, he brought in Dr. Schrag, and Ruth was taken to St. Joseph Hospital just a few miles south of here, where she was admitted as a patient. Ed was stunned. He told officers that he had never suspected Ruth and passed a lie detector test conducted by the Kansas Bureau of Investigation to prove it. Ruth Finley had spent years torturing herself, sending hate mail, cutting her own phone line, leaving feces on her porch. The man that tried to hold Ruth's hand on the street in front of this Macy's building may have been real, but other events had actually been fabricated, like the kidnapping. Dr. Schrag said she had a compulsion to do this. Once it started, once she told her husband that someone was bothering her, it became a compulsion. A subconscious impulse wouldn't let her stop. She really couldn't stop. End quote. The poet had become a hidden personality in her own mind. Years later, in a 1994 interview with Oprah Winfrey, Ruth explained that she had not been diagnosed with multiple personality disorder, but rather a dissociative personality disorder. The Wichita Eagle reported that with the help of therapy, Ruth discovered that her disassociation and psychological symptoms had begun after becoming a victim of childhood sexual abuse. At just 3 years old, as a young child on her parents' farm in Missouri, Ruth had been repeatedly assaulted by a neighbor. The large man had worn overalls with a red bandana tucked into his pocket. When Ruth, unable to explain her discomfort with the man, would cry about his presence, it angered her mother, who saw tears as a sign of weakness. Good little girls did not cry, and bad little girls don't go to heaven, Ruth recalled. She grew up feeling a tremendous amount of guilt about the abuse and, as Ruth's new psychologist, Dr. Pickens, said, blocked out the pain. Exposing Ruth's childhood trauma brought a new light of understanding to the threatening nursery rhymes and childish poems that she had written as the poet. In fact, one of the early letters received from the poet had read, "A fucked up childhood causes anger and hate. Players of games are forced to wait." A letter from Dr. Pickens to the court read, "Mrs. Finley has utilized repression in a massive way, ever since childhood, to effectively bury unacceptable feelings and wishes. These unacceptable feelings and wishes relate to anger and sexuality. Such repressions takes considerable amount of physical effort, but occurs unconsciously, not through conscious intent." He recommended intensive psychotherapy twice a week, which was difficult for Ruth. None of her family or friends had ever been in therapy. Her only exposure to psychiatrists had been that hypnosis and through movies, which rarely appeared to be a pleasant experience. For Ruth, therapy was as frightening a prospect as jail. A study conducted by the city had determined that the cost of the poet investigation totaled $370,000. Hundreds of hours had been devoted to protecting the Finleys and seeking the poet's identity, and some people thought that perhaps Ruth did belong in jail. But later that fall, at a press conference, Sedgwick County Attorney Clark Owens announced that they would not be pursuing any criminal prosecution. Psychiatric evaluations had determined that Ruth's actions as the poet were not malicious. Police and Ruth's psychologists believe that the blackmail attempt did occur. Pickens told the media, "Somebody called her about the attempted rape. We feel certain it was real." They also believed that she was really approached by a stranger downtown soon after that call, and believed that the unknown man was likely unrelated to the blackmail and may have simply confused her for someone else. These stressful events, in addition to the pain and fear she felt following Ed's perceived heart attack, had triggered a mental break in Ruth. In an interview that November, her first since the confession, Ruth thanked her family, hospital staff, and Wichita law enforcement, saying, quote, "I think I may have died and gone to hell. I think I'm coming back, though, thanks to the kind nursing staff and doctors at Wesley Medical Center Psychiatric Unit, and to an understanding family who stood by me." She also said, "I'm equally grateful to the fine officers of the Wichita Police Department who, in the end, saved me from either a mental breakdown or my own self-destruction. It's been a nightmare for all involved." Ruth Finley spent many years with Dr. Pickens, working through her mental illness with the help of therapy. At his direction, Ruth explored her past, her feelings and emotions in depth through their conversations and through the writing of poetry. Eventually, she was able to identify her own hallucinations and even remember some of the things that she had done as the poet. In June of 2019, Ruth Finley passed away at the age of 89. Despite all of the letters and the threats and the destruction, Ruth worked hard to leave the world a better place. Despite the embarrassment and shame she felt over her actions, Ruth chose to share her story, participating in nationally televised interviews. She chose to address the negative stigma associated with mental health and dissociative disorders. After years of shame, of fear, and of hiding, Ruth chose to be brave.